So I wanted to start by just recapping a little bit from last week. Just recapping a little bit from last week, and then we'll go into a little bit of a practice after that, a little bit of a meditative practice. So last week, mostly we explored seeing how conflict comes to be, noticing the patterns and habits of our own mind, and how conflict arises. The Buddhist teaching really pointing to conflict being a state of mind, conditioned, constructed. And so we looked a lot at the kind of conditioned nature of conflict and how we condition each other. When conflict arises, it's often different perspectives, different views. And the aspect of views, we talked a lot about how views are created, and that holding to views tightly is one of the primary ways that conflict arises. I think we see this, we understand this almost intuitively, that different views, different perspectives are kind of the ground or the place out of which conflict often arises. And so we explored a little bit of the Buddhist understanding of views and how views are created. We talked about papancha. We talked about the process of mind. Papancha, a broader understanding of papancha being not just a lot of thought in the mind, a lot of like proliferating mental activity, but also the kind of way in which our mind will kind of reify or solidify taking what we are experiencing to be what is actually reality, as opposed to understanding that what we are experiencing is something that is constructed in our own mind, our own experience. And so that combined with the views that are developed through our experience, those two pieces kind of solidify our perspectives. My way is right. I'm right. They're wrong. And that's a place where conflict is often arising. And so we looked at all of those kind of processes from a perspective of how the Buddhist teachings explore and understand those processes, because the one of the ways that we can really start to navigate conflict is through understanding how conflict happens, understanding the roots of it, understanding the processes in our own minds that contribute to conflict, and seeing that those processes are universal, that the ways that our own minds kind of create these tendencies to hold on to things, these tendencies towards liking things and wanting things to be a certain way, not liking things, wanting to get rid of things that are not how we like them. These are human tendencies. And so seeing these tendencies in our own experience helps us have some understanding that this is universal. We are all doing this. And as we see our own views as constructed, we understand that others also have their own views as constructed. As we see how we reify and hold on tightly to our own views, we understand that others are doing the same thing. And so this gives us some understanding of how this happens, of how conflict happens. And in my experience, starting to really see that as we see and understand how our own hearts and minds work, and recognize this is human. This is not just about my mind. It is human. As we see that, compassion for the human predicament is a result. It is a kind of natural outcome of the investigation, of the exploration to how our minds work. And we see, it's just like, I remember that time of just seeing, wow, yeah, this mind has the seeds of war in it. No wonder there's so much mess in the world. Just really a feeling of compassion for the nature of how we are as humans and what it has created. Also, there's a kind of a recognition that that understanding in the Buddhist teaching, the understanding of the state of things, understanding what is actually here and how it has come to be. This can create the conditions for us rather than to react in our habitual ways, out of greed, out of aversion, out of delusion, out of confusion, out of views and habits. We can begin to respond rather than react. And this was the quote I've brought in a number of times, which I put it again in the handout. And I'll read it again because I think it's a lovely quote and points to a lot of what I'm trying to get across. So from Buddha Recognizes Buddha by Daishin Morgan. To accept means to receive what is offered. Circumstances of life give rise to conditions, and our acceptance of these conditions is just the acceptance of things as they are. What is not meant by the idea of acceptance is any agreement or disagreement with the way things are. Acceptance is about basing ourselves in reality, not about making judgments of liking and disliking, of agreement or disagreeing. To accept the situation is to be grounded in the actual state of things, without getting lost in ideals of fantasies of how we would like it to be. We then have a good basis from which to see what action may be called for. Acceptance does not imply inertia. On the contrary, to be grounded in reality gives rise to a true response. And so this points to the possibility, seeing the nature of our minds, seeing the nature of how conflict arises, to respond from wisdom, from compassion, and from equanimity, as opposed to from greed, aversion, and delusion. So this is the pointing, the direction that the Buddha's teachings around conflict, they aim us in this direction. So the first piece, the first thing we have to be grounded in reality, as Daishin Morgan says. We have to be grounded in understanding. And so that's a lot of what we talked about last week, understanding our own processes of mind, understanding how conflict comes to be, understanding what's happening for ourselves, for others, for both. And so we often in our mindfulness practice and our meditative practice, we often do look at when there's reactivity happening in our meditation or in daily life, we look at trying to be present with it, to understand how's it affecting us, to see if we can investigate to understand what's going on in our bodies, what's going on in our minds, to see some of the processes at work. And often in the midst of daily life where conflict often arises, this is a challenge. We're right in the midst of it. Things are happening very quickly. So there are some tools, some meditative tools, and some of you who've practiced with me quite a bit have learned this before. There's a practice of reflection, which allows us to use the understanding that when thoughts arise in the mind, they affect us. We know this. I mean, we know this intuitively, and it happens a lot when thoughts arise, when, for instance, a conflict that we're having with somebody, if that were to arise in our mind kind of unbidden, we might find ourselves in a loop of thoughts and emotions and reactions. And yet we can use the understanding that when thoughts arise, they tend to create emotions and responses in our physical body, in our hearts and in our minds, to reflect consciously, to bring something to mind consciously. And so when we explore bringing something to mind consciously, perhaps at a later time in the day, when we have some space, in the midst of our day, things are happening quite quickly. We may not have time to kind of check in. Well, how is my body? What are the motivations here? What's the intention underlying this? What's being believed? We may not really have the space to do that in the moment. And yet later in the day, perhaps we do have some time when there's a little more settledness, a little more capacity to actually meet what happens when those thoughts come up in our minds. And so we can use this understanding that when we bring thoughts to mind, emotions and responses arise to reflect mindfully. And so we can use a reflective practice. I learned this practice from a monastic, Ajahn Amaro, a number of years ago, and it's a general tool. It's not just it's not only useful for things like this, for looking at difficulty in our lives or noticing or exploring conflict, but it's a way to think, to bring in a topic or a theme and see how it lands, how it feels present in our present moment experience, to bring that thought into mind now. And so we'll explore this together with for yourselves, picking some conflict perhaps that you've had over the last couple of weeks. And we'll go into this. We'll start with a little bit of a settling. And this is what Ajahn Amaro suggested. Start with the settling of the mind, a little bit of just settling the mind. And then you bring in what you'd like to reflect on, what you'd like to contemplate mindfully. Kind of dropping that theme or that scenario into the mind. And what happens when you do that is that, like Ajahn Amaro used the analogy of a pool. If you have a pool that has settled a little bit, that's a water pool that doesn't have a lot of waves on it, when you drop a pebble into that pond, it will create ripples. And so likewise, when we drop a theme or a thought into our minds, when there's a little bit of settledness, we can be available to notice what the ripples are. What are the ripples? What are the emotions? What are the reactions that arise when we drop a theme into the mind? And so we'll explore this. It's an incredibly useful tool for exploring conflict. As I said, it can also be used for other purposes. It can be used to explore a Dharma theme, or it can be used to explore making a decision. Just dropping an idea or a kind of a scenario of a decision into your mind and noticing what happens. But we will explore this today around conflict. I found it to be a really useful practice for noticing, again, learning, understanding what's going on for ourselves around a conflict. And so today we'll explore this kind of more an internal investigation. And after we've done it, I'll talk a little bit about how we might use this in other ways as well. So as Ajahn Amaro suggests, we start with a little bit of settling. And yeah, just let yourself settle in. We'll settle in for 5 minutes or so. We don't have to take a long time for the settling. So just letting yourself settle in a way that works for you. Perhaps connecting with the breath or the body. Or perhaps a receptive, open awareness. Whatever is your way in to allowing the mind to settle and let go. gently connecting with whatever is happening in your present moment. With an attitude of allowing what is here. If you're attending to the breath, allowing the breath to be as it is. Just noticing, how is this breath? If you're attending to the body, how is the body right now receiving? Exploring the perspective of allowing, not needing to agree or disagree with the experience. It is the way it is. Now I'd like to invite you to bring to mind an event of the last week or so in which there was some conflict. I'll give you a minute or so to reflect back and just pick one time, settle on a conflict experience that you had. It doesn't have to be the biggest thing, just sometime when there was a tension between you and another person. And settling with one experience, one conflict. Allow yourself to call up that experience fully in your mind. You can use imagination to do this, remembering details of where you were, what you were saying, what the other person was doing and saying. While you're creating this recollection in your mind, be aware of how it's affecting you now. You will likely be experiencing moods, emotions that are similar to what happened at the time. Check into your bodily experience, your emotions. Explore holding the imagination of the experience, and being connected with how you are now. The intention here is not to think about the experience or try to find an answer or figure something out. It's to begin to understand how that experience affects you now. You could refresh or kind of refresh the image of the situation in your mind and then check in again. How am I? See if you can be interested in the exploration. It's an opportunity to learn. Exploring the possibility of allowing what's arising, not judging it, just opening what is here as the mind recollects this conflict. It can also be interesting to be curious about how that recollection of the conflict affects your whole sense of experience. Often we orient to kind of very precise body sensations of tension here and tightness there, thoughts or emotions that might arise. And exploring the possibility of opening to the broad sense. How does the whole mess feel? Particularly connected with body. How does the whole thing feel? Maybe a kind of a body-mind feeling, jumpy, agitated, fuzzy. As we connect to the felt sense of experience related to conflict, there might be some aspect of the experience you could learn with. Sometimes we can drop in additional questions to the reflection. And not again to think about it, but just to invite. Think of the questions like an invitation. Anything else want to show up right now? What am I not seeing? And again, as those questions come in, it's not to think about them. It's an invitation to just keep opening what's here with those questions. What purpose is this feeling serving? What is being believed? I'm calling the conflict and curious about how it is being experienced now. What can be learned now? And being learned isn't about thinking about, it's about feeling with what's arising now. Yeah, at this point, I'll invite you to let go of connecting to the conflict and let yourself reflect on how a Dharma perspective might support you in the conflict. You can explore, reflect in terms of causes and conditions, impermanence, clinging, the value of non-clinging, non-identification, perspectives of compassion and loving kindness. And notice how it feels to bring in a Dharma perspective right now, too. What happens in your present moment experience as you bring in reflections on the Dharma perspective? Now letting go of the reflection, returning to a simple awareness of how you are now. That will likely include some of what's arisen in the last few minutes, but just opening to allowing what is here. Perhaps coming back to breath or body or simple receptivity. Just for the last minute or two of the sitting. So, are some of you willing to share what happened, what you noticed, what you might have learned? You just take a couple if anybody's willing to share.
I don't want to go into a big story. I'll just go into a little background. So I just got back from 6 weeks of being away, and my dog, who's a little poodleish creature, has started pooping all over. And so, all over in a certain area of the living room. And so it's caused a lot of deep searching because when I'm gone, but what was really interesting about this whole process was it started out with working on the situation with my dog and looking at the fact, some of the things that were very obvious is that I have no control. Things are impermanent, for one thing, that they always change, but that I have no control over the causes and conditions going on that, and yet there is some agency here. So what it opened into was a much deeper question about I'm 75, my husband's 79. My being gone is getting harder and harder for him and causing suffering both to him and obviously to the dog. And yet my Dharma practice, which is the reason I'm gone all the time, is the most important, valuable thing in my life. And I do not want to give it up. I can see it's becoming clear as he gets older and my husband gets older and there's more struggles that the point is going to come when I'm just not comfortable. So I'm in this gray area, and I see a lot of dukkha. I see a lot of uncertainty and lack of control. There's a lot of compassion that arises for myself and for all the players. But it was so interesting how, as we did it, the layers got deeper and deeper, and I realized that it was much more about my dharma lust for doing my thing and letting go of that. So it's all these many layers. So I think I've said enough, but
Yeah, I think I love what you pointed to. I mean, we often think, a conflict is at a certain level, but, when we really look at it, we see it's often not about what we think at the surface. There's so many different levels and layers. And so this kind of practice can really help us see, well, what is this actually about? And so that's beautiful that you kind of came into seeing that. And then decisions and perspectives, you can relate to the conflict more from where it's happening and learn and like make skillful choices based on what the actual situation is about. Yeah, so
and
that's beautiful.
there's one other thing that was really important. And that is really seeing very clearly there's no perfect solution here. And in seeing that, there was a real sense of letting go of something, of like wanting to be in control and get this right. And suddenly that just went away. So that
Yeah.
was, I think, the most important thing.
Yeah, that's beautiful to realize that. I mean, we often go into something think there's a right answer, a right way. And as we begin to explore the nuances, it's like, well, maybe not. So yeah. Yeah, thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Beautiful. And Sharon, yeah, and this will be the last share.
Thank you, Andrea. So my husband and I are doing a remodel at home, and in a pretty small space, we're having built an accessible bathroom. So conflicts are a multi, it happens like several times a day in our conversations. Um, what um, what I what I felt in my body, I don't need to describe because that would be so ubiquitous. But what I understood about my beliefs is that I have a really deeply conditioned belief that there's not going to be enough. So in this, and it's practically speaking, that's true. It's a small space. We're going to fit in a shower, a sink, a toilet. So, but it was very, uh, it released so much for me to recognize that I have this belief that there's not going to be enough. And what I realized that I wasn't seeing is that I look at my husband's behavior and reactions, and I feel my own reactions, which are really painful when we're in conflict. And what I wasn't seeing is how frightened we both are. Um,
Mhm.
so I think that's really all I need to say about it. But it was very great reflective, a very important reflective practice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. And again, I want to point in both of these scenarios, and some of you may not have had this experience um, of, kind of seeing something and having there be like, oh, right, that's what's going on, and a kind of seeing it from the Dharma perspective. There could be a little bit of spaciousness and maybe a different perspective from which to understand things. But when that happens, that's the understanding. That's the value of understanding. Even right in the exploration of understanding, a different perspective can arise, and it maybe even solutions, maybe not, but some understanding, like in Mary's case, recognizing there's not a perfect answer. Okay, we have to find what will work. And so, yeah, to recognize the value of the understanding in and of itself, that just that simple act of exploring understanding can really go a long way in working with conflict. you could explore this too. I mean, as I said, we mostly looked at this from our own perspective here. That's what the guided meditation was encouraging, looking at our own internal responses and reactions. For some of you, it kind of did, at least in Sharon's description, a little bit of description. Oh, we're both frightened, so it came to an understanding of like a little bit of what the other person was experiencing too. And that can be consciously brought into the reflective practice as well. Like bringing in the situation, first exploring what's going on for me, and then maybe dropping in the question, and what's happening for the other person? Like bringing that in to the reflection. We can't necessarily know, but there might be some understanding of that. There could be some knowing the person. If you know the person well, there might be some understanding of their conditioning, of their history, and what might be going on for them. So that can also be something that we could bring into this reflective practice. And I found that this kind of practice, and I think several of you mentioned, those of you talked about this mentioned this, the sense of compassion and care that feels like it arrives through this investigation for ourselves, and also perhaps for the other person as well. So those are beautiful possibilities from the understanding side of it, just from looking at the understanding side of it. And now I'd like to shift into what the Buddha talked about, or what the teachings are around kind of how we engage together, what our teachings around the relational field. And this a lot comes down to wise action and wise speech. It's a lot connected to that. Ethics as a guide for us in terms of navigating our relationships, and particularly in navigating conflict. I mean, I think that a lot of conflict arises when the precepts, when we are not engaging with each other with wise speech and wise action. Conflict arises. And so the understanding, the ethics, the ethical teachings around wise action, the precepts, these teachings emphasize non-harming. They emphasize not creating harm through our actions and our speech. And that goes a long way towards avoiding conflict. And yet in our navigation of conflict, we also need to look at maintaining our connection to the precepts. So just as a reminder, the precepts, refraining from killing, refraining from taking what's not given, refraining from false speech, refraining from harming with our sexuality, and also included in that is refraining from intoxicants. That more understood that when we are intoxicated, we lose our capacity to remember, basically, to refrain from these other actions. That's, I think, my understanding of what that precept is about, that it creates a lack of clarity in the mind. It has us losing our capacity to engage skillfully when there's an intoxication. And so the teachings emphasize freedom from suffering, the overall teachings. And so the engaging in action that would create or cause harm, to kill beings, to take what's not given, to lie, to harm with our sexuality, this creates harm in the world. And it also creates harm for us. And so that, of course, this is kind of a ground of what we're encouraged, how we're encouraged to act. And I want to emphasize that in navigating conflict, the piece that I want to really bring in navigating conflict, we need to take care to engage ethically. even if the people we're in conflict with are not engaging ethically. And I think this is a challenge because of that kind of, we bump up against each other. And when somebody is engaging unskillfully, that it creates frustration, it creates anger, it creates, I've got to respond in kind, or they'll just steamroll me. There's all kinds of relationships to that when we see people not engaged ethically. And so this is part of our internal work, exploring the resentment, the anger, the frustration when others are not engaging skillfully, when we see that others are clinging strongly to views about their right and their actions justify their means, for instance. So the reflective practice can be useful in helping us to come to terms with our relationship to that kind of a situation. So this is internal work, this kind of thing. These relationships, when somebody is engaging unskillfully, it's quite common and in some ways very natural to be angry, to be resentful, to be frustrated. And yet it is not inherently necessary to be angry, frustrated, and resentful when that's happening. Now, this is I think we might have talked about this a little bit last week, but this is something that when we're in the perspective of reactivity, of anger, of frustration, of resentment, of kind of like lashing out against somebody or being angry when somebody is doing something unskillfully, the perspective of anger it's got its own view. And the perspective of anger has its own view that, so this is wrong, this is bad, this cannot be, this has to go away. It's got that perspective. And it also has a kind of an energy. Anger has an energy of action. And that view and that energy kind of come together. And, when we're say, heisted by the energy of anger, that perspective tells us this perspective is the only way you're going to do something. So the perspective of anger thinks it's the only way to respond to something we're angry about. This is not true. This is a perspective of how anger looks at things. Anger thinks it is the way to act. It is the way to do things. It is the way to engage when there's a situation that is creating harm or is creating conditions of challenge or difficulty. This is one of the perspectives that comes up. And from that perspective, anger is not going to understand. Anger does not have any clue that there's another way to act, another whole set of motivations that also have energy for engagement. Compassion. Compassion has a strong energy towards engagement, towards wanting to alleviate suffering. And so the perspective of compassion is to want to take care of self, other, and both, and to take action to alleviate suffering. And so the relationships, when we see somebody engaged unskillfully, when we see somebody holding tightly to their view, when we see somebody doing things that are creating harm, the perspective of anger, of frustration, of resentment, that is not a necessary relationship. It is often the relationship that arises, and it needs to be seen. It needs to be understood as we did in that kind of reflective kind of practice. It needs to be seen and understood, and what's with it, what's underlying it, what's happening with it, what's going on there. And yet it is not the only perspective. And so as we begin to investigate, as we understand, as we do that internal work, we may begin to see there are alternative ways that compassion acts, wisdom, discernment can act and understand the situation from a different place than greed, aversion, and delusion understand situations from. So this is an important piece, that we hold to the precepts, not acting out unskillfully, even as we feel that those relationships, even as we feel the anger, the resentment, the kind of committing to not taking what's not given, not stealing, not lying, not harming beings with our actions, even as we may be experiencing opposing mind states. Now, this is an important piece in terms of navigating conflict, at least in my experience. You know, we can't act out of those unhelpful. If we act out of those unhelpful motivations, act out of greed, aversion, or delusion, that reinforces greed, aversion, and delusion both internally and externally. It reinforces the pattern of a conflict, it tends to reinforce that pattern. And so to not act out of those mental tendencies, and yet also to not repress those tendencies, that's an art of our practice. How do we do that? How do we not repress and not express? Not repressing our anger, our hostility, but not acting on it unskillfully. So there's a lot to explore there. So this, to me, it's very, I've seen this a lot in my own practice, to observe and recognize those patterns that tend to make me want to act, but to not follow through on the actions that they're kind of motivating, but also not to repress them. It's a challenge. And yet this is a big part of, I think, some of the work that can really support us in navigating conflict skillfully. Seeing that, holding to the precepts, committing to non-harming, helps us also to see all of the mental machinations that go on behind our wanting to do that, behind our wanting to lash out, our wanting to speak unskillfully, to act unskillfully. And again, that brings us back to the recognition of, this is human. This is not just my mind that wants to do this. This is multiplied by 8 billion people. And again, that recognition for me is such a point of compassion to see and to recognize. It's compassion for myself. It's not just about me. It's not some flaw, some personal flaw in me that this happens. This is happening for everyone. And if I see myself holding tightly to something, of course, somebody else is holding tightly to something. And so again, it can create the opening to compassion and recognizing different perspectives, and how can we maybe navigate different perspectives. So we are encouraged to hold to the precepts, to not act unskillfully. And the first sutta quote, so I numbered them this time. The first sutta quote encourages us also not only to abstain from creating harm through our own actions, but to encourage others to abstain from creating harm. So this quote, the first one, and how is one an individual who practices for their own benefit and for the benefit of others? There's a case where an individual abstains from the taking of life and encourages others in undertaking abstinence from the taking of life. They abstain from stealing and encourage others in undertaking abstinence from stealing. They abstain from sexual misconduct and encourage others in abstaining from sexual misconduct. They abstain from lying and encourage others in abstaining from lying. They abstain from intoxicants that cause heedlessness and encourage others to abstain from intoxicants that cause heedlessness. So this is a training that encourages us to hold each other accountable, to actively encourage and promote the ethical conduct. And this gets into our next really big topic, which is how do we do that is through our speech. This encouraging others to, I mean, if there is some of it, I mean, I think that is not done through speech, in our engaging in our families, for instance, if we engage in ethical conduct just as the way we do things, then the children growing up in that field absorb that. So there are ways in which this encouragement can happen non-verbally. And I think a lot of it does happen through speech. So that's our next topic. And we'll take a break now for 5 minutes and come back. We'll come back and we'll review. We'll take some questions first and then move on to the exploration around speech. So coming back at 5 after the hour. And so we have a few minutes for questions. There's a question in the chat. When sharing on intoxication, it occurred to me that intoxication may be way more widespread if open to include intoxicated by views, by emotions, by harmful mind states. I'm curious your reflections in the Buddhist teachings on this. Up to now, intoxication for me was alcohol, but now seems much broader. I think in terms of the precepts themselves, I look at the precepts as being very concrete actions that we can abstain from to help us begin to see what's happening in our minds. Now, it does, I think the sense of intoxication, what we get intoxicated by can definitely, we can be intoxicated by anger, we could be intoxicated by power. And so the flavor of that movement towards, the way intoxication makes us behave, I think there are some similarities there. But in terms of the precepts themselves, I look at those as being specific actions that can be, they're achievable, let's say, that these are achievable actions, the precepts. Refraining from killing, refraining from taking what's not given. These are physical actions we're refraining from. And what, in terms of expanding or broadening the precepts, to include, I'm not going to be intoxicated, taking a vow, the precepts are often considered vows. I will refrain from killing. I undertake the training. I'll undertake the training to refrain from killing. I'm going to undertake the training to refrain from stealing. It's much harder to say, I'm not going to have my mind intoxicated by anger. That's a mental process. And so, to take a vow there around that, Bhikkhu Bodhi brings this up in his discussion of the precepts. He says it kind of puts us in a double bind. It might make us more repress those tendencies as opposed to really getting curious about them. The whole of the Buddhist practice, I think, in many ways, is looking at how we are, and we could use the word intoxicated by our views, our opinions, our emotions, and get carried away by them. We lose our capacity to be careful when we are intoxicated in these ways by these mind states. And the whole of the practice is encouraging us to begin to refrain from physical actions that would follow through on those, and to explore internally. What is the experience of being intoxicated by anger? What is the experience of being intoxicated by power? What is that experience? You know, the feeling of being carried away by it. We can know that feeling, and we can also feel the unskillfulness of it. So that's I think that being really the whole way the practice unfolds is in terms of that. So other questions or comments about the precepts and exploring it with respect to conflict.
So the conflicts by anger, what happened to me in the exploration was that I found myself feeling superior to the person that I, was in the conflict with. And then I said, well, why do you want to do this? And it was, well, to cover up my own inferiority feelings. And so if I do that, I think other people do it too, probably.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a very common thing, like I'm better, and that's that's a key piece the Buddha asked us to again, to look at, not to repress, not to self-judge about. It's, oh, this is human. I feel superior. Okay, what is that? What does that experience feel like? And what is it based on? Kind of to begin to be curious and to explore that. Yeah.
And that brings up compassion.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it makes it much easier to explore it both internally and also the denigration, the othering side of it, right? There's two sides of feeling superior. There's the side where we feel like we're, somehow elevated, and then we're denigrating somebody else. And so, to notice both sides of that. Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Chris, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I was just curious about when you said feel, I think your last answer to a question about feel the unskillfulness of that. Is that kind of like feeling into the dukkha, like the pain of anger, the pain, I mean, because there is maybe an intoxicating, pleasant feeling of energy, but there's also pain there, right?
Yes.
And that can be a motivating factor to stop doing that, or to refrain from engaging in that view or that kind of energy.
Exactly. And I think that's essentially how the mindfulness practice works, that we, through that curiosity of what is the experience, what's the human experience of this mind state. And anger, for instance, anger was a big one for me. I explored anger a lot. And during one retreat, it came up so much that I remember it as my anger retreat. I really got to explore it and to experience what was going on there. I definitely felt the suffering of it, of the pain, the constriction. But, and there was also at one point exploring anger that it was a little bit of a shock. The first time I really saw anger internally, it was a little bit of a shock at how much it was painful here. I thought it was going to make the other person miserable. And I was focused on that. And so that's often what our minds do when we're not clearly aware of what is the experience of these mind states internally. we're focused on how they're going to, make other people do what we want them to, or whatever, so there's that kind of focus externally. And it was a little bit of a shock to me to see, oh, this actually hurts here. The other thing I saw really clearly during that retreat was just the first split second of anger arising. There was so much of a feeling of power and agency and control that part was really pleasant. I saw so clearly what the hook was, that's why the mind thinks anger is going to do it for me. There's that feeling of like, I know what to do, I know how to do it, and I have the energy to do it. So there's that momentum there, but it so quickly shifts into the suffering when we are noticing what's happening. But it was quite interesting to see, both sides of it. The side of the hook, where there is that feeling of power and agency that comes with the anger, and then the feeling of all of the suffering and distress, and then the reflection also of, how that does ripple out into creation of a cycle of anger. So yeah.
And would you say like like that part, like the hook part, that too is a form of dukkha in and of itself?
Oh, yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Because that's the clinging part, that is like the clinging to what we want, or the pleasant.
That's right.
And then the aversion comes afterwards, maybe because it feels, both sides of the coin, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And the clinging side, or the clinging to the pleasant side, is often harder to see as dukkha, but it also is dukkha, and the clinging is dukkha. When we see the clinging, the holding side of it, it's like I'm right side of it, there's actually suffering there too. There's a tension to that. It's a little subtler, than the burning of anger. But there's a tension to that. I'm superior, I'm right, I'm better. There's also a tension to that. There's a needing to maintain that. And so there's actually suffering right in there as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And then Vicky, the last one before we move on to the next topic.
Well, I kept raising my hand, taking it off, because you were answering my questions, and other people are, it's really helpful, so helpful to be, I mean, this is all, I feel like this is, anger is my sort of personality type. And there's a lot of conceit. I saw in some of the quotes that conceit was actually used instead of anger, which I was really interested in, because I realize a lot of conceit. I think my question is, and you've answered a lot of them already, and it's been helpful to hear other people speak and know they're having the same experience as me. So in terms of the repression, so like I'll try to follow the precepts externally, but internally I'm not really following it. Do you know what I mean? So I'm still angry. I'm still telling myself I'm right. Attachment to view. And so then I build a lot up internally, even if don't do it externally. So I wonder if you could.
Yeah, it can almost be that we resent maintaining the precepts.
Yes, exactly.
And so and I mean, I think that the piece of it is to not repress the the anger internally, but to have some curiosity. What does it feel like? So that's the balance. That's the hard part. So it's not about just like, okay, I'm not going to do that, but really I'm going to like have my ball over here and I'm just going to hold on to it anyway.
Yeah.
That's not the teaching around the exploration. The exploration is, okay, what does it feel like to really want to hold on to this? And so, yeah, I mean, some curiosity about the experience internally. So you're aware of it. So that's a good step. You're aware that you're still angry inside. And sometimes it might be, like that sense of, again, needing to hold on to that anger. And maybe in the midst, this may be a useful thing for using the reflective practice. right in the midst of something where you're actually actively refraining, it may not be so easy to do the investigation around, well, what does it feel like to be angry while I'm not doing this? But later in the day, perhaps bringing up that situation, remembering okay, I didn't do that, but felt this way. That might be a way to begin to open to the feelings in the anger and what's being held on to there, actually, what the views are, what you're not seeing. You might be able to use the reflective practice there to give you some capacity. And the other valuable piece about the reflective practice is that doing it at times when we have more capacity, at a time of day where we've got some space, we're seeing what arises for us in that moment, like the feeling of holding on to the anger. We feel that, and we're gaining some skill in watching it when we have more capacity, and that can begin to filter over, or over time it can begin to be that we have more capacity right in the midst of our daily life to be able to see those things and feel them right in the midst of our daily lives. But often, initially, it can be really useful to do the reflective practice and explore it that way.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Vicki. All right, so let's shift to speech. Wise speech. So the basic teaching, there's several ways the teaching on wise speech is framed, and one is the kind of the refraining from, kind of the way the precepts are worded, refraining from false speech, refraining from harsh speech, refraining from divisive speech, and from idle chatter. And I'd say the first three are probably most relevant in terms of conflict, refraining from false speech, harsh speech, and divisive speech. So this is quote number 2, aspects of wise speech. And this quote brings in kind of like I didn't actually point out in terms of the precepts, just to speak in terms of the precepts, that as we explore the precept for not killing, as we explore that precept and notice any tension or, any wanting to hold on to our views and perspectives, we can hold that acting the precept and understand that, for instance, the refraining from killing is an expression of compassion, even if we don't quite have the feeling of compassion in our hearts. It is an expression of compassion. And if we can remember that, that can be cultivating that quality of compassion as we are actively refraining from killing. Refraining from stealing, taking what's not given, cultivates a contentment. Refraining from lying cultivates truthfulness in the mind. Refraining from creating harm through our sexuality is kindness and cultivates a kindness in relationship. So that acting on these precepts has kind of a flip side to cultivating a wholesome quality as we engage with that action, or with refraining from that action, refraining from killing. We can know that it's supporting cultivating compassion. And likewise with speech, in this excerpt, it makes it quite clear. Abandoning false speech, one does not tell a lie for their own sake, for the sake of another, or for any reward. One speaks the truth, holds to the truth, is firm, reliable, no deceiver of the world. And so this is kind of recognizing that refraining from false speech, speaking what's true, cultivates truthfulness, cultivates non-deception. Refraining from divisive speech, and divisive speech being understood as speech intending to create division in the world. This is a lot of what's going on in the world right now is speech intending to create division. And it says, you know, what one has heard here, one does not tell there in order to break people here from people there. So that's the definition of divisive speech, is this speech intending to create division. It goes on, thus reconciling those who have broken apart or cementing those who are united, one loves concord, delights in concord, enjoys concord, speaks things that create concord. And so this aspect of wise speech, refraining from divisive speech, moves us in the direction of promoting concord and unity. Then refraining from, so it's again, it's understanding both sides. We speak what is true. We refrain from speaking what is false. We speak what is true. We refrain from divisive speech. We speak what unites. We refrain from harsh speech, which isn't quite defined. It's called abusive speech. And this I take to be speech that attacks somebody personally, or it's either spoken words that attack personally or a tone of voice that would have a combative tone of voice. So abandoning abusive speech, one speaks words that are soothing to the ear, affectionate, that are polite and appealing to people at large. And so the refraining from harsh speech or abusive speech, one cultivates the movement towards speaking to promote friendliness and kindness. This process has effects both internally and externally. You know, it affects the world, even just refraining from harsh speech. And Gil has a great sentence that's something like, is what you say improve upon silence? You know, just even not speaking harshly, not speaking divisively, the silence can be very supportive and very healing. And so, you know, refraining from false speech, harsh speech, divisive speech has an effect internally and externally. It has an effect externally in that it doesn't add conflict to the situation. It has an effect internally in that it helps us to see, you know, the motivations, the movements that would tend us to create that kind of speech. And so it affects our own minds as well as the situation. It's supportive for ourselves and others. And that comes back to the trainings, the first quote, how does one practice for one's own benefit and for the benefit of others? We practice for the very act of following the precept is a gift to others, but it is also a gift to ourselves. It gives us the gift of freedom from remorse. So that's the kind of foundational teaching on wise speech. We refrain from harsh speech, false speech, divisive speech. I'm not going to speak too much about idle chatter. I mean, I do at times, but we have limited time and mostly focusing on conflict here. There's another set of teachings, and this is in the third passage, kind of framing how speech is well spoken. And so the teaching on wise speech points out what to avoid, the type of speech to avoid. And this talks about the kind of speech that is well spoken. When speech possesseth 5 factors, it is well spoken. It is blameless, and irreproachable among the wise. What 5? It is spoken at the proper time. What is said is true. It is spoken gently. What is said is beneficial. It is spoken with a mind of loving kindness. And so essentially this, to me, points to cultivating a mind of non-conflict when speaking to others, holding these 5. Is it spoken at the proper time? This basically, this quote points to both what we say and how we say it. 2 of them are about what we say, It is what is said is true. So it's not deceptive, it's not false. So speaking what's true, and it's beneficial. This beneficial, my understanding of this, it's not defined so much here, but beneficial in general, what is skillful is what increases the wholesome and decreases the unwholesome. So that's saying things that tend to increase wholesomeness and decrease unwholesomeness. Wholesome actions, wholesome mind states are those that are not based in greed, aversion, and delusion. Unwholesome mind states and actions are those that increase greed, aversion, and delusion. So what is true and what is beneficial, that's the content of what would be offered. Something that's true and something that's beneficial. The way it is spoken gently, in a tone or manner that is gentle. It is spoken with a mind of loving kindness, so a heart, a mind that has loving kindness. And then it is spoken at the proper time. So this one, I think this one, there's some investigation around speaking at the proper time. This is an investigation both for ourselves. Am I going to say this at a time when I'm balanced, when I'm not going to get triggered by bringing up this conversation? Am I established in the quality of loving kindness? Am I established in gentleness? What's the motivation? Why am I saying this? So there's some reflections internally around speaking at the proper time. And then, as best we can, also speaking at a proper time for others. Is the other person going to be able to hear what we're saying? Are they in a state of mind where they can receive what we're saying? So this is a pretty high bar, I think. These five, it's a pretty high bar, and I think we're going to have to practice, noticing when we're not speaking in this way, noticing when, I'm saying something and the heart doesn't have loving kindness in it, or noticing actively, the tone is getting stronger. So this is a practice. This is a practice. The other piece there's several pieces around wise speech I want to get to. There's a lot in all of these, but I want to make sure to cover all of the basic pieces. The teachings around wise speech, refraining from harsh speech, refraining from divisive speech, the teaching around speaks words that are soothing to the ear, that are affectionate, that are polite and appealing to people at large, in terms of abstaining from harsh speech. We might think that this means that we never say something that somebody would find displeasing. We might think that this would mean that we don't criticize other people. And yet the teaching around encouraging others to maintain the precepts points to there is an encouragement to speak when people are not engaging skillfully. And so there's a teaching on this. This is the fourth sutta. I'm going to summarize it. This is a teaching the Buddha is having a conversation with somebody, with Potaliya. And he says there's four kinds of people. There's somebody who might speak dispraise of somebody who deserves dispraise, and does not speak praise of someone who deserves praise. Someone else might speak praise of someone who deserves praise, but does not speak dispraise of someone who deserves dispraise. Another person does not speak dispraise of someone who deserves dispraise, and does not speak praise of someone who would deserve praise. And this one is interesting. This one, the 3 and 4 are the ones that really kind of are where the conversation rests on. So I'll read these two. Still another person does not speak dispraise of someone who deserves dispraise, though the dispraise would be accurate, truthful, and timely. And he does not speak praise of someone who deserves praise, though the praise would be accurate, truthful, and timely. Still another person speaks dispraise of someone who deserves dispraise, and the dispraise is actually accurate, truthful, and timely. And he also speaks praise of someone who deserves praise, and the praise is accurate, truthful, and timely. And then he asks the Podalia, which of these 4 persons seems the most excellent to you? And the person responds, of these 4, the one that seems the most excellent to me is the person who does not speak dispraise or speak praise, because equanimity is the highest thing. That's what this person said. And that may be what we think that the teachings are pointing to, that we would not correct somebody. We would not say something to somebody. You know, I'll be equanimous about this. I'm not going to act. The Buddha's response was, of these 4, the one I consider the most excellent is the one who speaks dispraise of someone who deserves dispraise. And dispraise would be accurate, truthful, and timely. So following those guidelines for wise speech, and who also speaks praise of someone who deserves praise. And the praise would be accurate, truthful, and timely. For what reason? Because what excels is knowledge of the proper time to speak in any particular case. So here the Buddha is pointing to, again, kind of needing to hold each other accountable, to speak praise where praise is true, useful, timely, and to speak dispraise, to criticize, essentially, the word here, dispraise, to criticize, to call out, we could say, someone who is not engaging skillfully. So there's some other teachings on how to do this. How do we call people out? How do we speak the dispraise? How do we reprove somebody? There's several teachings and pointings on this. And for the sake of time, I'm going to skip a couple of the sutta quotes and not go into them in depth. But in terms of reproving, it encourages us to, in terms of speaking dispraise, it encourages us to establish ourselves in the 5 qualities of speaking at the proper time, speaking truthfully, speaking gently, speaking in a beneficial way, and with a mind of loving kindness. So that's what we ground ourselves in when we're going to tell somebody or reprove somebody. Establish ourselves in those qualities that promote skillful speech. That particular quote, number 5, the reproving quote, also points out how somebody should receive being reproved. And I think it's important here because, again, there's going to be a back and forth, always a back and forth. A person who is reproved should be established in 2 things, in truth and non-anger. If others reprove me, whether at the proper time or an improper time, whether about what is true or what is false, whether gently or harshly, whether in a beneficial way or in a harmful way, whether with a mind of loving kindness or whether harboring hatred, I should be established in truth and non-anger. If I know there is such a quality in me, I tell him, it exists. This quality is found in me. If I know there is no such quality in me, I tell him it does not exist. This quality is not found in me. Without anger and with truth. So acknowledging the truth, whether or not the person is speaking skillfully, we ground ourselves in these 2 qualities, truth and non-anger. Some of you may know the simile of the saw. I'm not going to go into this one, but it is basically pointing to, you know, again, the non-anger part of somebody doing something that is creating harm, somebody doing something that is not skillful. And it points out that we should maintain non-anger and loving kindness to these people. And he uses the simile. Even if somebody is sawing off your limbs, you should maintain this non-anger and loving kindness. So again, a very high bar. But he does use that kind of simile to help us say, you know, if I remember that simile, can I, you know, be okay if somebody says something nasty to me? You know, it's like, you know, I'm supposed to hold this idea of non-anger and loving kindness, even to people who saw off my limbs. Can I do that for somebody who's saying something unkind to me? And so this is a deep encouragement to maintain that non-anger and loving kindness. Then I'm going to, yeah, I'm also going to kind of just quickly talk about the Sutta number 7, which points to 2 different kinds of speech that I think are interesting to consider. So the first line of that passage is, it was said, one should not utter covert speech, and one should not, and there's a typo here, one should not utter overt, sharp speech. And with reference to what was this said? And again, it's pointing to when covert speech, and covert speech I understand to be speech that's spoken behind somebody's back, not to their face. And so this would be kind of divisive speech, potentially divisive speech, you know, speaking behind somebody's back. And so again, it comes back to is it true? Is it beneficial? Is it correct? When one knows covert speech to be untrue, incorrect, and unbeneficial, one should not utter it. When one knows covert speech to be true, correct, and unbeneficial. It's true, it's correct, but it's not beneficial, which again promotes greed, aversion, and delusion in the mind. One should try not to utter it. But when one knows covert speech to be true, correct, and beneficial, one may utter it knowing the proper time to do so. So again, this is pointing to again, the divisive speech. The intention in divisive speech is in order to divide. In this case, covert speech may have an intention to create concord through understanding. You know, and this, you can think about this, you know, even just in terms of, you know, sometimes it's talked about gossip. We're not supposed to talk behind somebody's back. We're not supposed to talk about somebody who's not here, and people holding that as being a rigid rule. You know, it's like, oh, I'm not supposed to talk about somebody who's here. But here, this points out covert speech, talking about somebody who's not here. I mean, if you're talking about somebody who's not here and you're talking about, you know, I heard this person fell down. This person needs some help. Can you come help me with them? You know, that's speaking about them behind their back, but it is not for the purposes of division. It's for the purposes of supporting them. So there's some nuance in understanding what covert speech. And then similarly with overt sharp speech, again, sharp speech might be something, overt sharp speech I would understand to be something that somebody does not want to hear. So it's something you're saying to something that they would not find pleasing, that they would not find, you know, delightful to hear. And again, the encouragement is, if it's not true, if it's not correct, if it's not beneficial, don't say it. But if it's true, correct, and beneficial, and it's a proper time to say it, which would mean the other person could hear it, you're established in these qualities of loving kindness, of care, of compassion, then you can say that. there's this next teaching, the next passage, coming again from the exposition on non-conflict, which is the sutta that we started the whole course with, brings in how we might speak dispraise of somebody, how we might do this. It gets a little more detailed rather than just saying true, correct, beneficial. It goes into a little more depth in terms of beneficial, is my understanding of this quote. It was, how do we say something beneficial when we are bringing up something that might be hard for somebody to hear? And so this one, I want to spend a little bit of time here. Most of the texts, most of the teachings apply this to speaking the Dharma, this what does it mean to extol or disparage somebody? It's mostly applied to teaching the Dharma, but I think this teaching can be more broadly applied to speaking in terms of being in conflict, how we might engage in terms of speaking around what's happening in a conflict. So this passage begins, one should know what it is to extol and what it is to disparage. And knowing both, one should neither extol nor disparage, but should teach only the Dhamma. How does there come to be extolling and disparaging? When one says, and this is where it's kind of pointing to the Dharma teachings, and there's a few examples given in the sutta. I'm just using one in this passage, so you could look at the sutta itself and see the others. And this is where I'm going to broaden this teaching to conflict. When one says, all those engaged in the pursuit of the enjoyment of one whose pleasure is linked to sensual desires is low, unbeneficial, and are beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and they have entered upon the wrong way, one disparages some. So essentially, this is pointing to the teaching on pursuing sense pleasure, and that this is not a beneficial direction. And the disparaging is when one says, people doing this are doing it wrong. That's essentially what this passage says. You're disparaging somebody when you say, people who are doing this wrong. This is bad, basically. And then when one says, and likewise on the flip side, when one says, all those not engaged or disengaged from the pursuit of the enjoyment of pleasure linked to sense desire, they have entered on the right way, then one is extolling or praising somebody. And so he says both of these are not helpful. Both of these are not helpful. The saying these people are doing it wrong, these people are doing it right. That's essentially what it's pointing to, right? It's like, these people are doing the right way, these people are doing the wrong way. The next paragraph points to how you might engage in conversation around this. And it's subtle, but it's important. When one says instead of, when one does not say those people engaged in the pursuit of the enjoyment, but says instead, the pursuit is a state beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and the pursuit is the wrong way, then one teaches the Dhamma. When one does not say those disengaged from the pursuit are right, but says instead, the disengagement is a state without suffering, and it is the right way, then one teaches the Dhamma. What essentially is being pointed to here, I understand what's being pointed to, is that rather than saying the person is wrong, the person is doing the wrong thing, it's pointing to the state of the mind. The state is not helpful. The state is suffering. The state will lead to conflict. The state will create struggle, stress. The state leads in the wrong direction. Likewise, on the other side, when one says the disengagement is a state without suffering, that is the right way. It's not pointing to the person, it's pointing to the activity of mind, essentially, and pointing out the benefit or the harm of the state of the mind. And so I think this can be applied to speaking to people in terms of conflict, rather than praising or blaming or praising or praising the person, to speak to the Dharma, to speak to causes and conditions, to speak to states of mind that are not helpful, to speak to consequences. What are the results of these kinds of directions, as opposed to you're doing it wrong? It's like, let's look at the results of this kind of action. Let's look at the result of this kind of quality of heart and mind. What happens? This is the pointing, I think, in terms of speaking what is beneficial. How do we speak what is beneficial? So this requires an understanding of what is, a deep understanding of what is helpful and what is not helpful. What is, how greed, aversion, and delusion lead us into suffering, and how non-greed, non-aversion, and delusion, compassion, kindness, wisdom lead us away from suffering. What leads to dukkha? This can help us in speaking in this way. But I also think that, just the simple kind of taking the person out of it, right? They talk about this as ad hominem attacks in the political realm, attacking the person as opposed to what the sense of the proposal or something is. And this is happening a lot in our discourse these days, this kind of ad hominem attacks. And so exploring what it might mean to kind of take the personal out of it in terms of expressing a perspective, expressing this direction feels like it's not helpful. Let's see, let's explore what the consequences of that are, what follows from that. So again, thinking in terms of the perspective of causes and effects, conditionality. What are the consequences in terms of exploring these kinds of conversations? So I see we are nearly at the end here. I want to leave a couple of, at least take some other comments and questions if there's anything, because this has been a lot, this last piece. So yeah, any questions or comments or reflections? Jeannie.
I'll have a hard time trying to speak to the generality of the direction we're going in or something like that. But I have kind of a rule for myself when I'm speaking to someone personally to only say I and not you, not the pronoun you. You only use the pronoun I, my reactions, what came up for me, etc. Not ever say you, because that's accusing someone and then they react strongly. So
yeah, that's a good beginning, I think.
Yeah.
and yet it is, we have to be careful. Even using that, sometimes it can, subtly slip into, I feel attacked, or, I don't know. It's just, it can have a subtle blaming quality to it even then. But to that's a good beginning, I think, in terms of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Beverly.
I've just been struck about how exactly this maps onto exactly how you do horse training. And he's perfect. I mean, at the beginning of the conflict, well, you had a conflict with the horse this morning. Does he have a different point of view? For sure he does. And the stuff on speech being timely and kind and beneficial is, and you do speak in different ways, is just so right on. And if you get mad or you get frustrated, nothing good happens at all. Yeah, I mean, the horse just doesn't get it, and he gets upset, and he's not doing anything, and it's a real training for that.
Yeah, yeah.
I
So
was struck.
yeah, apply that to your people.
Yeah, I'll try. Yeah, and especially you have to tell them when they're doing something wrong, right? There's no training, right?
Right.
And so you can't just say everything's good and be a quantumist. That won't work. You'll have yeah, it just maps so perfectly. Yeah.
Thank you, Beverly.
Yeah.
Mariana.
Even when you had the question at the beginning about a conflict, I was struggling a little bit because I'm spending so much time just on the computer by myself. Don't have that much person-on-person conflict. But I find my feelings being aroused a lot by viewing conflict or hearing it spoken. And one of the things that relates pretty well to the current political situation is just, what if you have a person who is mentally ill or cognitively declined? They're not going to be able to hear what you say, but other people are still going to have to talk about them and deal with that situation. And on the one hand, it seems to me clear that one of the things you can do is say, well, keep in mind, the truth is that this person's behavior has to be understood in terms of this cognitive or mental health issue. But also, praise and blame. I mean, it seems like we do have a need to talk about, one should not talk about that person in that way. I don't know. I'm being a little vague here, but I get caught up a lot in, should I criticize the way this person is being talked about? And if so, given that I'm not face to face, what is appropriate?
Well, again, I mean, this could be considered a kind of a conflict around, you feel potentially some tension around how somebody is being spoken about.
Yeah.
And that bringing all of these teachings to bear on this, again, it depends on, can this person hear a perspective, can this person hear that the way that it is being received, the feeling that's being received is one of harshness or divisiveness around that person. And so it's like there can be communication made without that intention. And again, we can't necessarily second guess their intention, but we can feel sometimes the quality, again, based on tone of voice or something, that we can feel the quality or the tone of voice there. And so, there could be the pointing to when I hear something, when I hear something in that kind of tone of voice, this is what comes up, so that it's not speaking in terms of blame, but it is speaking in terms of the consequences of what happens when somebody says something in what's perceived as an unskillful way. And so again, the teaching on receiving somebody's unskillful teachings is what we have to come to here again. So the one where it said, when somebody is reproved, and in this case, it's, when somebody is hearing something that feels challenging, one should establish oneself in truth and non-anger. And so so what is true here? What is true? And can I not have anger arise, or can I hold to not expressing anger at the very least? Can I not express anger and hold to the truth, as it says, okay, this is here in me, and this is not here in me, or this kind of way of speaking creates or arouses frustration or tension in me. So that I again, not speaking directly to the situation. I can't know what your situation is so much, but just kind of establishing yourself in non-anger and kindness, truthfulness in terms of these responses. And some investigation could also be useful here. It might be coming back to what we talked about last week around dialogue might be useful there. It's like, what makes you speak in that way about that person? What is it that, so that there could be a conversation and investigation around that theme.
It seems like, okay, so it seems partly like, okay, what I need to focus on is if there is a person being talked about essentially covertly because they're not face to face, and I don't think the way they're being talked about it might be truthful, but I think it's divisive or harmful. I need to pay attention to not getting caught up in the anger at that and figure out what would be a positive, timely way to point it out. Because I feel like one of the things that happens is that when people mock someone who's having a physical or a mental problem, they're creating a problem for everybody else who has a mental or a physical problem, and that we are not, as a society, talking about that enough. But how can I bring that up in a way that does not add on by saying you shouldn't talk that way?
Right, exactly. And that's a challenge. I mean, it's not easy. I mean, and if this is something that comes up for you, you could do some reflection on it. Think about what might be a way that I could say this. What might be a way that I could engage around this without that anger.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And we are out of time. So yeah, I had a little bit more I wanted to offer, but it'll have to end there. There's a couple of resources. The resource that I put in the around the resources on conflict and resolution of conflicts perspectives from the Theravada canon, that's in the handout that I gave you. And then there's another book. I will put this in the chat right here. If you want to hang out for just a minute, I'll put this in the chat. This is a book by Bhikkhu Bodhi, The Buddhist Teachings on Social and Communal Harmony. I got a number of the quotes and resources that I brought in from this book. So if you want to do further research, and I will type that into the chat, and you're all welcome to unmute and say goodbye. And